Good Sunday morning, Northeast Ohio, as we wrap up another pivotal week in the race for the White House. The president suffering two 7-2 losses before the Supreme Court on the issue of the releasing of his tax returns, but holding serve at the same time as the court sent those cases back to the lower courts, meaning it is unlikely the public will see any financial documents before the November election, something we actually talked about 4 years ago before the last election.
By the way, I will release them when I'm not under audit. I'm under a very routine audit. I've been under audit for years. Every year they audit my tax returns. I guess
Would that be before the election?
I hope so. I mean, if I'm finished by then, it will be before the election. But it's a routine audit, and I'll release them after the audit, no problem.
4 years later, the White House says the audits have yet to end and the returns have yet to be released. The president taking to Twitter on Thursday to talk about that, taking to Twitter on Friday to talk about the nation's mail-in voting system. This less than 3 weeks after saying 2020 would be the most rigged election in our nation's history. In his Friday tweets, President Trump spoke of mail-in ballot fraud in many elections and re-echoing his earlier claims of a rigged election. His comments echoing those of his Attorney General William Barr last month.
It absolutely opens the floodgates to fraud. Those things are delivered into mailboxes. They can be taken out.
I think what you're really looking at is, in some ways, a campaign tactic that Trump is using and that his campaign will likely continue to use to delegitimize the results of the election, given that it will likely rely a lot on mailed-in ballots.
A Dartmouth College study last year on the effects of unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud found that it is a difficult bell to unring, finding that even exposure to fact checks do not reduce the damage from the accusations. That being said, News 5 political analyst Tom Sutton says research nationally as well as in Ohio shows the traditional vote-by-mail voter tends to be older and lean more Republican.
So really, quite frankly, if anything, the Trump campaign would likely benefit if more states went to all mailed ballots come November.
And Sutton says the president likely right on his claim that election results might be delayed. It's actually something we saw in our own April primary. When you have a large volume of vote-by-mail ballots, they're going to take a lot longer to tabulate. That is something, by the way, that Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose is addressing in his appropriately named Ready for November task force.
There's two things in that. Ready for November is what we're working to make sure that we are, and task force implies that this is a group of workers.
And that work expanded this week to the state's 88 county boards of elections with the Ready for November directive outlining how the money from Washington and the CARES Act to help make sure things go smoothly in 17 weeks gets spent. Ohio received $12.8 million, with 87% of that money going directly to the counties. LaRose wants to see the money used for recruiting more poll workers. Ohio needs about 35,000 of them to pull off an election, but many of them are older and may not be willing to work for health reasons. LaRose calling for unprecedented efforts to recruit new poll workers and backups. Other directives include more election infrastructure to handle the expected increase in absentee voting, PPE to help keep poll workers and voters safe, additional ballot printing, and just being flexible.
We're trying to reinforce our current group. We're trying to make sure they feel comfortable once they're out there, and then we're looking for the creative ways then to move forward.
Creative again, mainly with recruitment, be it through civic organizations, colleges, or even high schools where they are eligible. Well, getting creative is something we have all had to do when it comes to balancing our budgets and dealing with the strain of the coronavirus pandemic, and you can count the state of Ohio in that category as well. Most of us try, not always successfully, to stash away spare change here and there for an emergency. The state of Ohio is no different, only their sock drawer is called the Ohio Budget Stabilization Fund, or as we know it, the Rainy Day Fund. Nearly $2.7 billion set aside for a rainy day. And Governor DeWine has conceded
it's raining.
The governor acknowledging this week that the time has come to ease the financial burden on the state as we start the new fiscal year, facing what was projected in May to be a $2.5 billion deficit. The good news since?
Not as bad as we thought it might have been, but certainly not good.
The governor resisted the urge to dip into the fund too early and instead cut funding for education, for example, by 3.7% as an early warning to districts. Start tightening your belts.
What I wanted to do is make sure that schools knew, what was coming.
To put it in household terms, that $2.7 billion in the fund is the equivalent of a person earning $50,000 a year, having $3,900 stashed away for an emergency. It's enough to cover expenses for about 4 weeks. DeWine's not the first governor to raid the fund. George Voinovich did it in 1991, later building it back up. So did his successors Bob Taft and Ted Strickland, who famously left the fund in 2010 with just 89 cents during the Great Recession. It was Governor John Kasich who took it to its current level, a gift to his successor that DeWine acknowledged this week he will spend.
We're certainly going to use a lot of the rainy day fund. And by the time we get completely through this, I'm sure we will use all the rainy day fund.
Now, one bright spot is the new tax day is Wednesday, July 15th. That means state and local governments will finally be seeing the money that they have been owed since April 15th. With Democracy 2020, I'm John Kosich. Enjoy your Sunday. Stay safe.